própria startup. Ele criou uma plataforma de video discovery há um tempo atrás, chamada Redux. Depois disso, ele já trabalhou no desenvolvimento de produtos como Zynga, Flickr e Facebook. E hoje ele é o Head de Product Development de uma empresa muito cool, que vocês deveriam dar uma olhada, que é bem bacana, chamada Jana. Para falar com a gente, então, eu chamo Aditya Kashyap.
Hi, everyone. So a lot of folks have talked over the last couple days about growth and how to grow our products. I'm going to speak specifically about how to grow products from day one during inception. So when you're thinking about products from scratch, how to think about growth as something integral to the design of the product, something truly at the base concept. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about structure and culture at startups and what's sort of conducive to growth, and then we'll get into some of the tactical. Some of you may have heard this quote, and I think Jeff Bezos sums it up pretty well. You need to keep teams fairly small to foster true innovation. Products that are developed by committee tend to be lacking vision. They don't have a real conviction, and they don't necessarily do anything well. And if you're trying to iterate quickly and fail fast, it's much better to have a few strong hypotheses that you can test with smaller teams rather than trying to boil the ocean with a product or an idea that does too much in too short of a time. And so what we're talking about here is a team of less than 10 people, I would say maybe even 5 to 7, in many cases without a product manager in the early days, but at the most maybe one product manager, 4 or 5 engineers, and 1 designer. And that's really the strongest atomic unit when it comes to innovation. The second sort of tenet that's important that I've seen in most successful startups is keeping the organization as flat as possible. And I had the fortune of working at larger companies as well, where this was also true. And this means a couple things. So a couple places in the past had leveling structures that were completely obscured. And so what that meant was, whether you were a product person with 1 year of experience or a product person with 10 years of experience, your ideas were equally valid at the table. Everybody was comfortable presenting because nobody knew anyone else's level. Aside from senior management and VPs, nobody knew anyone else's titles. And so you could really focus on the merit of the idea and not necessarily the pedigree behind the idea. The second point here is making sure that each product team, and this is both the engineers as well as the product managers, truly feel like owners of the product that they're presenting. And so what that means is, as much as is possible, allowing them to really champion their ideas. And Facebook is a great example of this, and Zynga in the early days as well, where product managers and product teams, eng leads, will go and present directly to the CEO. And sometimes there will be some other managers in the room, but what's great about that experience is it really makes the successes and the failures of the team their own. And they can have mentors there to give them feedback before and afterwards on how to present, but it really makes them feel empowered. And it's a great thing for company culture as well. Weekly all hands. This is becoming more and more common on the startup scene, as well as mid-stage companies, and it's something that wasn't always there. It's more of a pep rally, a place to really cheerlead and get folks excited about wins that happened the last week. So you really want to pick successes here, and we'll get to the flip side of this next. But here, this is really a positive meeting, one where you highlight teams and how they're doing some great things around the company. and also a time for senior management to engage directly in Q&A. And this is a time to be completely transparent, and I'll harp on that a little more later on. But more and more, we're seeing, especially with earlier companies, Series A and Series B companies, being extremely transparent and candid with where their growth numbers are, where their revenue numbers are. And I know that might not be possible with later stage companies, but as much as is possible, it's quite important to be as forthcoming as possible. And also recognizing exceptional employees. Almost every week that I was at Jhana, as well as my own company, Redux, we recognized outstanding all-stars. And it really made people feel recognized and valued at the company. And if you know true product leaders and true engineering leaders, more than necessarily any sort of title, what's important to them is respect and recognition for their excellent work. And then now this is the flip side to all hands, and this is where you get into the nitty-gritty. Product, it's called product review at some companies, numbers review at other companies, and this is where you have each product team going in and really sharing the results of experiments that they're running, how the business health metrics are doing, how the user metrics are doing, or maybe in some cases even how the revenue metrics are doing. And it's a time for product leadership to really be held accountable and really be put to task, and for people to poke holes in their logic, and to really present their roadmap and their future decisions based on data and design principles. Way too often, both when I was building my own company as well as some of the earlier stage companies I worked at, one of the chief complaints was that product was in a black box, and that people that didn't necessarily stay inside a certain organization had no sort of idea around the logic and the decision framework behind some of the decisions that were made by that particular team. So this blows that up. If you have 10 product teams, they're all sharing their rationale with all the other teams. And I think the biggest upside here is true learning across different teams. Way too often, especially at companies that have multiple products like Zynga, if you don't make an active effort of doing this, you end up with silos, where maybe Farmville has a bunch of learnings and Poker has a bunch of learnings, and Cityville has some other great learnings, but nothing really gets shared. And this is exceptionally crucial and a real key differentiator, especially if you have multiple successful products. And then lastly, transparency. Transparency is incredibly important, and that's why I'm just going to keep repeating this. But more and more, you're seeing earlier stage companies, even before I joined Jhana, the founders were more than forthcoming in sharing their numbers. And one of the reasons is, as I mentioned before, it's about respect and really showing that everyone at the company is a true stakeholder. And it's also about trust. Too often I hear the argument that you can't share some of this sensitive data because it may get leaked. But especially with companies with less than 100 folks, I absolutely think founders and executives should be as forthcoming as possible. So now we'll get into some of the tactical things around growth. So this is a standard growth framework, and we'll go through a couple of these, but the essential sort of idea is, you sort of recognize and reach out to your customer, you engage them and get them to try out your product, and then they eventually become advocates for your product if they like your product. And this is another one, a little bit more detailed, gets into a little bit more of the details on how to sort of raise that awareness, but fundamentally it's still the same. And these are both great. And then you can even get more complex and get really into the weeds here. This is a viral engine that really gets into the weeds of how to do push notifications correctly, how to do messaging and email blasting correctly, and create a virtuous cycle. And that's all great, and we can talk about all this in the Q&A, but I really wanted to talk about growth on a higher level and sort of through a different lens. And so the lens is pain, and it really goes to the 80-20 rule. And I really feel like if you focus on these three key pillars initially as you're thinking about what sort of product to build, and what sort of customer experience to build, this is where you should start. So the first pillar is recognizing that your users are in pain and reaching out to them when they're in that pain. The second pillar is addressing that pain. That's your product. And then the third pillar is identifying other secondary and tertiary pains as a ways to expand your product, to expand your company, expand your business. And again, we can get into all these different tactics during the Q&A if you like, but it comes back to that 80-20 rule. If you do 80% of the leverage, you'll get with 20% of the things you do. And these four things, in my opinion, are really at the crux of what you need to have a solid growth engine. The first two, landing pages and user acquisition from existing platforms, relates to the first pillar. The magic moment is, we'll get into it in a little bit, but it's really a moment, maybe within 30 seconds or within a minute, where your users really understand your core value prop. And you really users have a pretty short attention span, so you need to be pretty quick and pretty simple in explaining that to them. And not by telling either, by showing. And then lastly, the daily habit. This is something simple and repetitive that they can do that will convert them into a long-term retaining user. The other stuff is all great. SEO, email blasts, and marketing, and there's entire books written on each of these other disciplines. But if you don't have these key things, you're probably not going to do as well as you should. So this is how those items map to the framework. The existing platforms relate to reaching out to those users in pain. The magic moment and the daily habit relate to addressing the pain. And we'll go through each of these in detail. So firstly, reaching out to users in pain. It may seem obvious, but too many startups start out building a product and then go with a strategy of buying ads or buying traffic to drive users towards their product and check it out. And many companies, after trial and error, have discovered that actually the best way to acquire users and the most effective and efficient way to acquire them is to reach out to them wherever they're suffering today. And to do it in a really genuine way. And not to sound like salespeople as if you're really just looking at them as a commodity, but truly feel their pain. Have true empathy for the user. So one of the best examples of this is Airbnb. And they tried a lot of early growth tactics in their early days, but one of their most effective ones was when they realized that their customers, their current customers that they were trying to get, were suffering on Craigslist. That's where the real suffering was happening that Airbnb was trying to solve. On Craigslist, you would go on there, you weren't sure about the identity of the host. Sometimes they wouldn't respond for days, maybe weeks. And you didn't have any idea about the quality of the location that you were booking either. And Airbnb was solving all of this. But it was doing so in a silo. And so some of the product folks there came up with the idea of creating a tool that would automatically post the Airbnb listings onto Craigslist. And this was a tremendous success. Because even if those users didn't convert immediately, after time on Craigslist, you were booking Airbnb listings, the brand started settling in. And eventually, more and more people went down the funnel and started using Airbnb directly as they got more familiar with the brand. And so this is really about a long-term mindset and not just thinking about the next week or even the next 15 days. Another example is Truecaller, which is pretty big in some emerging markets. And they're a spam blocking product, so they block spam calls. And so as an exercise, think about how do users suffer with spam calls? Where is that field of pain? Where are they suffering? Well, if you really think about it, it's actually on the OS level, because you get a phone call on the OS level. Unfortunately, if you're a Truecaller, you don't have access to the OS level, at least not in the beginning when you're trying to get on people's phones. So what's the next best place to target a user that's suffering from spam calls? So what do people do when they're suffering from a spam call? They usually curse or get upset. But the next thing they probably do is they probably go on Google and either search for spam blocking or they actually type in the number that just called them to understand who was calling them. And so with Truecaller, we can put landing pages for each of those phone numbers, even though they don't own that phone number. And then basically explain to the user, hey, if you had Truecaller, you would understand or know the identity of this phone number. And furthermore, we could have even blocked it for you. And then the last example is a personal one with Flickr. We had a treasure trove at Flickr of user data, of people having awesome conversations around Flickr groups, which is a community where people discuss not just photos, but also specific topics like geographic locations to travel to, or even photo gear, or just flowers and random objects. But a lot of this was buried, and it was closed off. And the early thinking was, we want to be exclusive the way Facebook's exclusive. And in order to get access to this content and to get in on the discussion, you really need to have a closed box and get people to sign up. But as a test, what we ran was were small campaigns where we would expose these pages to search engines. And what we found was we started bubbling up in the search engine rankings pretty quickly for travel destinations. So we were, in the early days, we were right up there with some of the travel websites because people were coming to Flickr for travel. For photo gear, that's an obvious one. But what we really found was we benefited much more by reaching out to users in pain than to expecting them to somehow hear about Flickr and then sign up and hope that it solves their pains. And then there's Instagram. And there was a big debate early on about whether Instagram was doing the right thing and in building on top of Facebook. And some people had called this a mistake and said, well, Facebook didn't piggyback off of another social network, so then why is Instagram posting everything on Facebook? Doesn't make much sense. They're not going to have a real defensible moat. But what Kevin understood at Instagram was the users that were really suffering were the Facebook users. And the way they were suffering was that there was a lot of other things going on Facebook that had sort of been tacked on over the years. Facebook had been a relatively simpler product early on, and over the years that you added chat, you added all sorts of newsfeed posts, you added groups and discussions and all sorts of other things. Then you had games spamming you with notifications. And actually one of the core use cases for Facebook was photos. And that was one of the ways that they grew tremendously. And Kevin recognized that, and he said, we're going to go back to those roots and simplify things. And so this was a breath of fresh air, because after years of having a newsfeed populated with all sorts of noise, you were seeing one beautiful photo. And at least the photo users and the people that were using Facebook primarily for photos recognized that, and they reacted in a really positive way, and eventually became Instagram users because they constantly saw that brand reinforced. The second pillar is the magic moment. And it's harder to define than simply saying that it conveys the value prop, because it's going to be a little bit different with each product. But the main idea is that you have a very short window in which you have to make it clear to the user how your product makes their life better. And it's shorter than you think. And usually, most data shows that if you don't explain this to the user in the first time they try out your product, you're probably never going to get them back. And so the biggest leverage you're going to get is on day one, and that's why this is so critical. And not having this, you can have the best engine, like the one we saw earlier with the viral loop engine. You can have all the science behind your product and how to do the best SEO and the best marketing. But if you don't have this, then you're sort of dead in the water. It's like having a car without an ignition. When we were thinking about how to reinvent Flickr, when I first got there, we really looked at a lot of different ideas and a lot of different pains around photos. And the one we recognized that really stood out was that people were going to a safari in a different country, or they were going to a birthday party at their friend's home, and they were coming back with 300, 400 photos that they took with their phone. And 200 of them were maybe of the same lion, and they didn't know which one to pick and to share out, and how to organize different photos and albums. They may have like 1,000 photos of their kids. And it just became a really sort of intimidating task. And generally, human beings, when we're when we're faced with a lot of work, our natural reaction is to procrastinate. And so what we saw was a lot of people taking a lot of photos, but those photos just sort of sitting in cold storage, and nobody really doing anything with them because the proposition of having to organize them and decide which ones to keep and which ones to delete, and then who to share them with, it was just too much work. And we really tried to solve that in a really magical way. And what we came up with was Flickr 2.0 and the camera roll. And so in this magical moment, within a few minutes, in this case, you would have your entire set of photos organized automatically with our technology. And this was our magical moment. And users reacted tremendously to this, and we saw retention go through the roof. And it's much easier to fix things higher up in the funnel and fix retention on day one than it is to figure out how to grab another couple days out of the users 30 days down the road. Facebook has an amazing magic moment. So you come into Facebook, and then within a few seconds to a few minutes, you have social context around your friends and what they're up to. And in some cases, you have instant social gratification. If you post something, you may get likes immediately. And that's a great feeling. And you immediately get what Facebook's about and what it adds to your life. And then there's Zynga Poker. And the fun thing we learned here with Zynga Poker was more than the actual poker game, what people felt was really magical was getting something free chips every day. And that was the magical moment for Zynga Poker, was coming in every day and getting free chips. And once that was in the product, it was tremendous. Oh, looks like. So, anyways, this slide is about the daily habit, and really how to craft a habit that's maybe 15 to 30 seconds long, and really becomes routine for the user every day, so that their daily lifestyle is inseparable from your product. And that's really how you convert a user long term and keep them around months down the road. Zynga Poker's daily habit is one of the strongest that I've seen. And early on, we had the free chips mechanism that I mentioned, and the daily habit was actually sending chips to other friends. And we found that this worked really well. But one of the problems with this early on the left side was that, as you can see, there's a lot of points of failure. If the first user sends a bunch of chips and the second user accepts them and just doesn't do anything or doesn't send anything back, you lose that loop. You lose that ability to create a virtuous cycle. And then there's 4 points of failure there. And it may seem super obvious now, but it wasn't back then, which was that you could actually distill all of these user actions to one. So instead of having a user send chips and then another user accept them and then decide and be prompted to send chips back to your other friend, we just decided to make one single action which both accepted chips that your friend sent to you and also sent chips back to them. Now you might ask, why would any user do this? If I'm a user and I want chips, why would I, after receiving chips, send them back? That seems like a zero-sum game. It doesn't seem to make any sense. And what really worked here was actually Zynga realizing that it was cheaper for Zynga to foot the bill there and actually gift the chips themselves than to have the user send them back and forth, because the lift that they got in usage out of the product way overwhelmed any sort of inflation that was happening to the economy. And so this was a tremendous win, and it increased user retention, engagement, as well as revenue. When you're thinking about the daily habit, try and make it inherently viral. And so what I mean by that is like that Zynga example, something that in its own right, whenever somebody's taking that habit, they're immediately also a marketing channel to acquire another user. So the three examples here are likes on Facebook, which is the daily habit on Facebook, which is also viral because it goes out to your friends, and then they see it, and then they like things back. Collecting chips on poker, and then with Flickr, sharing photos, and sharing pre-curated photos on Flickr immediately notifies a user that they've been shared, and then they look at them, and then they comment on them or engage on them, and then you feel great and you get social gratification. And so that's a viral daily habit as well. But the key thing to take away from this is that if you can figure out a way to make your magic moment and your daily viral habit the same, then that's when you've really hit your holy grail. And that's what these 3 products have done. So I would encourage you all to think about that, and if there's a way to do that when you're thinking about the next product or the next company you're trying to build. Thank you.